Welcome to Myth versus Craft. Hello everyone. My guest today is the renowned drummer Jimmy Chamberlin. Though he can play pretty much any type of music, he's best known for his time with the Smashing Pumpkins. Jimmy belongs to an exclusive fraternity of drummers that helped change the face of music in the 90s. Along with his contemporaries, like Stephen Perkins of Jane's Addiction, Dave Grohl of Nirvana, and Matt Cameron of Soundgarden, Jimmy reintroduced sophisticated drumming to rock music and laid the foundation for the music revolution of the 1990s. As you listen to our conversation, I think you'll agree that Jimmy is also a deep thinker and extremely knowledgeable about music. Here we go. Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
I understand that your father played the clarinet and your older brother was a drummer. What kind of music did they play?
Well, my dad, who was born in 1925, so, was a real fan of the big band era and, followed closely the careers of Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw and then later Pete Fountain. But, so my dad was a big band guy, really Duke Ellington, Count Basie, that type of stuff. And then my brother, who's, I think, 13 years older than me, so he was really a product of, the mid-'60s, late '60s, and through the kind of psychedelic era, and then into, I guess, what would be the dawn kind of jazz fusion. So, my brother listened to everything from Hendrix, The Who, all the way, to Jeff Beck and Tony Williams and that type of stuff. So I had and then I had three older sisters as well who listened to everything from the Beach Boys to Joni Mitchell, and everything in between, Steely Dan. My middle sister Nancy was a huge Sly and the Family Stone fan, big Stevie Wonder fan, so really into like Marvin Gaye, into Philly Soul and Motown. So my house, was a pretty crazy, you could walk from room to room and kind of cross the country and cross, many time zones, just moving from the living room to, one of the bedrooms.
Did you start playing the drums because of your brother, or was there something else?
I did, yeah. I'm the youngest of six, and, I always looked up to my brother Paul and still do. We're still, best friends. And, just as younger brothers will do, just emulating their kind of cooler older brother, and then just fell in love with it. I kind of, started because of him and then immediately found my own path and my own trajectory and just really became consumed with it.
Did you have much of a sibling rivalry with him when you were both playing drums?
Yeah, not really. He like I said, he's 13 years older than me. So, he was so far ahead of what I was doing. I will say, later on, as I got into my teens, there were a couple instances, I think, where we had auditioned for the same band, here and there. But I wouldn't call it a rivalry. I would call it like, just brotherly love.
The reason I ask is that I think of Stevie Ray Vaughan, who looked up to his brother Jimmy and idolized him and eventually ended up overshadowing him and the dynamic between the two of them, which was really interesting.
Yeah, I think you can look, there's many, life gives us many yardsticks, and I think as musicians, we certainly get our share. But as far as that goes, I always look at, drumming is drumming, and, the amount of people in the room doesn't really predicate the value of the drumming. So, we never really looked at least I never looked at it like that, like, oh, I made it and he didn't, or, in fact, an interesting kind of anecdote to that is that my brother's now 60. I'm 51, so he's 64. He's a property owner. He invested in real estate a long time ago. He owns a business. He loves working on cars, so he owns a business. He's also the treasurer of his church. He does yoga, 2 times a week. He's a beekeeper. He's a complete, he started competitive karate when he was 50.
Wow.
Just got into it. So he's, this kind of de facto Renaissance man, and then plays drums on the weekends, at a very high level. My kids are 9 and 13, and they're huge fans of Uncle Paul. When is Uncle Paul coming over? Because he's, the cool uncle. But, to put it in perspective, I've got, this kind of storied career and I play, and I've got, a studio here in my house, drums, multiple drum sets, and, a pretty cush setup. And my kids, sometimes will just say, why are you so miserable? Like, why can't you be happy like Uncle Paul is all the time? So, I think, to put it in perspective, happiness is not quantified by, how many people are in the room. It's basically kind of what you've made out of your own kind of life. So, and my brother Paul is the living embodiment of, somebody who has a very rich life that includes drumming, but not certainly exclusive to that.
I read that you started taking lessons at age 9. I also read that you broke your arm when you were 12 and you placed a drumstick in your cast to be able to continue playing drums. That's pretty intense for a 12-year-old. Did you have any interests outside of drumming at that age?
Well, baseball. I mean, I was a big a baseball player, and I thought, if the drumming doesn't work out, maybe I could be a baseball player, or vice versa. But yeah, I was a pretty dedicated practicer, and I think once I figured out, and this is a great thing about art, right, and music in particular, it gives you the experience of giving and interacting with this causal relationship between, the more accountable I am to my instrument, the more pleasure I get from it. So I experienced that at a very early age, with my lessons and kind of practicing. So I had a very dedicated practice regimen. So when I did start taking lessons from Charlie Adams when I was 9, who was a great teacher. He happened to live in a couple blocks from my house, about a mile from my house, and was really one of my brother Paul's rivals. So Charlie Adams, who now plays with Yanni, lived in Joliet. Him and my brother Paul were probably the two best drummers in Joliet, and they were, basically the same age. Paul maybe a little older, but they were kind of going at it. And Charlie was more of the, he studied drummer. He took lessons from Bill Crowden up at Frank's Drum Shop here in Chicago, and my brother Paul was kind of more of a self-taught drummer. But both very good drummers in their own right. But, learned all of my book technique from Charlie. And then, when I did break my arm, which I broke, I think, playing flag football at the Catholic Church, I was in the midst of this, as all musicians go through, they go through these spurts of progression. And I was just in this, about to turn a corner on a bunch of stuff. So, yeah, the cast only went up to my elbow, so I could move my arm from my elbow. So I would just stick a drumstick in my cast and then just move my arm on the ride cymbal and just try to play everything else with my left hand. And that went on for about 6 months. So it ended up actually being kind of a blessing in disguise, because it really added to my ability to be ambidextrous. And I think it has a lot to do with, when I set up, I've got a lot of crashes on my left side. I'm not real right-hand heavy on the crashes. I think I only have one, 19 or maybe a china over there, and then everything else is on the left. So I think that had a lot to do with that. But, it's just things that happen to kids,
You played in a wedding band, then a polka band, and eventually a band called JP and the Cats, with whom you played for 3 years. How old were you at this time?
I was pretty young. So, obviously I started at 8. I practiced, my butt off for 4 or 5 years. And actually the first band I was in was a band called the Warrior Band, which was a band that was made up of just guys from my neighborhood who were quite a bit older than me. They were all in their early 20s, and I was probably 14. And we were doing, Rocky Mountain Way, lots of Foreigner, that type of stuff. And we gigged pretty regularly because everybody, besides me in the band, was over 21. So we were able to play the kind of club circuit around town. And then I got a gig with the Eddie Carosa Polka Party, which was a pretty big polka organization that had, on Saturday nights, they had this thing called Polka Party on Channel 26 in Chicago, which is way before cable. And Channel 26 was the Spanish station, albeit for 2 hours or 1 hour in the evening. 1 half hour was a fishing show, I think, like Babe Winkleman, and then the other half hour was Eddie Carosa's Polka Party. So every Saturday I played on the Polka TV show, and then Sunday I would do the radio show. And that went on for a couple of years while I was still in high school. And that was really just great experience, because you had to play, super crisp polka drumming at extremely low volumes and still try to be dynamic. So I learned a lot doing that. And then through the various kind of rock bands that I played with in Joliet, one of which was playing an opening slot for a band called JP and the Cats. And JP and the Cats was a kind of legitimate touring show band. They were a 10-piece, more of like an orchestra, a 10-piece band with 4 lead singers, a horn section, and they were doing some pretty sophisticated charts like West Side Story and some other stuff, and, along with some great kind of comedy and really more of like a review. And at the end of that gig, the drummer for JP, Rob, who was actually JP's brother, came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm leaving this gig, and JP, loves your drumming. Would you be interested in coming and auditioning?" And I thought, man, I finally made it. Like, these guys are the real deal. They had a bus. They were playing 30 shows a month. So I jumped on it. I went up to DeKalb, Illinois, and auditioned and got the gig. And literally, like, the 3 days later, I was playing, every night. And that went on for all the way up until the time I joined the Pumpkins. I was with that band.
Oh, wow. Were you supporting yourself strictly through music at this time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I was just and I always was. So, there was a point where, JP, I had disconnected from JP for a little bit, and actually my brother had taken over, and I started doing some construction work in Joliet, just because I always loved it, and it was really good money. But I was still playing with JP, once in a while. And then when I joined the Pumpkins, I was kind of doing both. I was working construction and playing a little bit with JP.
I believe it was 1988 when you were still working in construction and met Billy Corgan and started playing with the Smashing Pumpkins. How long did it take you to become fully comfortable playing their music?
The Pumpkins, when I joined, they were really more of a pop band. They were more of REM with a little bit of Bauhaus, maybe Love and Rockets, that type of thing. So it didn't take me long to assimilate into that, but it didn't take me long to figure out that there wasn't really a lot in that type of music for me. So when I joined the band, there was a specific set of songs that they had been playing for a while with the drum machine that I just kind of came in and learned the drum machine parts and then just kind of replaced the drum machine. But it wasn't until Billy and I really started exploring, the parameters of our own musicality that it became, a much more interesting relationship. When I think, we started working on things like I Am One, and, I had the groove for the intro for Tristessa, and then we started doing things like Window Pane and Snail, and he was starting to build in drum solo type stuff at the end and really starting to write, not to me, but around me. That's when it really started when I started to be able to make it my own. Because up to that point, I wasn't interested in playing that stuff. I was really more of a devotee of, Mahavishnu, Jeff Beck, Weather Report, Tony Williams' Lifetime. Yeah, that's the stuff that I really, really dug and really resonated with me. And I don't think, I don't know how long I would have lasted in the Pumpkins if I wasn't able to interject that philosophy into the music. And that's really, I think, once Billy realized that, hey, this kid, he's a lot more than I thought, we were able to really take the music and cast a wide net with it.
I've been talking to many of my guests about not only the craft of songwriting and the music side of things, but the business side of the music industry. I understand that everyone in the Pumpkins was pretty comfortable with that business side, and you control your promotion, your merchandise. You managed expectations by releasing Gish through a smaller label, even though you already had the deal with Virgin Records. You knew when to say no. You passed on offers that might have been tempting but weren't a good fit. Where do you think this business acumen came from?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think, in all fairness, I think a lot of that came from Billy. I think he was really, the person that kind of dictated the integrity and the destination and the kind of mission statement of the band. And I think, we all really back that up. And it's like when you have a company, you have a mission statement and a vision statement. And then, the job of the leaders, and in this case, there was probably 4 people that had opinions, so call it like 4 co-founders. Our job is just to completely, back up and, completely continue to sell that mission and vision statement. So, we learned the business in and around the parameters that we had set for ourselves. And that, still holds true to today. I mean, there's things that we know, don't fit with the Pumpkins. And it's just because, we set those boundaries for ourselves early on, and we knew that to break those boundaries would have been to devalue, what it was about the band that had value. So, I think, everybody had their line, and Darcy certainly had, a lot of opinions about how the band looked. James had a lot of opinions about how the band was perceived. Yeah, I had tons of opinions about what we were going to play or how it should be performed or how things are going to be arranged, how demonstrative or how many faces we were going to melt. and Corgan had lots of opinions about what a great song was, so that was an incredible combination that added up to a band with an incredible amount of integrity, because there was never an opportunity. Nobody would ever let their guard down long enough for anybody else to put any type of bullshit through, right? Nobody was going to allow a bad photo to leak out. No, although you could argue that all of those photos from back then were bad, but certainly not according to us. But there was a ton of songs on the scrap heap that lots of people would have thought were A-sides, that just didn't pass muster for one reason or another. And a lot of times it would be, the person you would you would think would have the least amount of opinion. Like Darcy would just be like, look, I just don't like that song, and that would be good enough for us to just say, man, we need to take a closer look at this, because if she doesn't like it, there must be a good reason we're missing. Right. So I think when you can harness that, with respect to everybody, you create something like the Pumpkins that, becomes bigger than the sum of the parts.
Let's talk about your drumming. Butch Vig, who produced both Gish and Siamese Dream, said that you have a magic feel, that you do this push-pull thing and create a hypnotic groove. I've heard that you typically didn't play to a click track, which enabled you to add some movement to the tempos. Do you still dislike playing to a click?
Yeah, I mean, it was never a like or not. It was just, clicks are just tools, right? And some songs, like when I record today, I've done it for long enough to know, like, okay, I should do this to a click because I've got components going in later. It's going to be difficult, right? Basically, the decision to use a click or not to use a click had more to do with the emotional context of the song. Like, what is it going to hamper? Is it going to be additive? And a song like, 1979 or Try, or something that's really, more reliant on the narrative to kind of move things around, that, it's a lot easier to do those things to a click. Songs like Poor Selena or Jelly Belly or I Am One, songs that are kind of visceral and more fluid, for me to interpret those songs correctly, I really needed to be able to move in and out of the verses. And Billy and I got so good at it that if there was a long word, I knew to pull back so he would have time to articulate. I mean, there's so many micro decisions that go on when you're recording. And the other thing was, we found that going for full takes with the drums and really putting the onus on the drums to convey some of the narrative really made for better songs in the end. So we just got used to not playing to a click and not using Pro Tools. And well, there wasn't Pro Tools back then. So, and even on Zeitgeist, we went, no click, full takes to tape for the drums. And I mean, I got so good at it that I could roll off 10 takes of a song and they'd be within a second of each other with no click. I mean, you get to, you practice them so much and you'd have them so much committed to muscle memory that then you're allowed to perform the song and micro focus on the nuance. And I think that's really what Butch was kind of keying in on. We had a lot of nuance in our playing that was really hard to put your finger on. But whenever you tried to change it, it was like a souffle. Like if you walked on the floor too hard, it would just collapse.
Did any of the producers with whom you worked get nervous or resist not using a click?
No one ever really. I don't even remember talking about it that much. I mean, Flood and I talked about using it on, when we would overdub drums, like on songs like Raindrops or Try, or 1979, we knew that we were going to be putting stuff on top. So, or I was going to play and we were going to loop it. We would do that type of stuff to a click. But generally, we were kind of left to our own devices. And we really weren't caught up in, trying to grid stuff or it was just, hey, does it sound great or not? Because the music we were always attracted to, it just didn't get caught up in that type of stuff, like Derek and the Dominoes or the Allman Brothers or, Jeff Beck. I mean, a lot of that stuff there's Zeppelin even. I mean, there's movement all through that stuff, or even, great classical pieces, Ulysses Stravinsky or, Cole Porter or Duke Ellington or anything like that, Paul Whiteman. There's tons of movement in the orchestra. So we were always trying to just do what's best for the narrative, and sometimes that meant letting the music kind of move in and around it.
As a quick sidebar, you mentioned the Allman Brothers. Have you ever played with another drummer, like with a two drummer setup?
Oh, yeah. In fact, Matt Walker and I have done it a few times. My brother and I are constantly playing with each other, but, hats off to those guys. I mean, Haimo and Butch, those guys play together incredible. And I'm a huge fan. I mean, I learned how to play drums, largely because of jamming to, the Allman Brothers. I'd put on those records and just play, the entire Fillmore East record or, Beginnings or any of those great Allman Brothers records is a drum lesson in and of itself.
And the reason I ask is that I'm familiar with how you might orchestrate or arrange two guitar parts to complement each other, but I have no clue how you work something out with another drummer.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like playing in a jazz band, right? So I play in a jazz quartet and a jazz quintet, and you've just got to be cognizant at all times of what the other guy's doing and how you're going to be additive or subtractive to that combination. So, I think Haimo and Butch were just great listeners, like like Elvin Jones would listen to McCoy Tyner or Coltrane and try to react to what they're doing. Obviously, in drums, you've got to be doing it in real time and trying not to, flam all over the place on somebody else's downbeats. But I think that stuff you get used to doing. The other part just becomes this kind of sixth sense of knowing how somebody plays, knowing when they're not going to play something, and knowing when to insert yourself into that space.
You mentioned Elvin Jones. I want to say I read a quote from him at some point talking about Keith Moon and complimenting Keith Moon on being a great drummer precisely because he was a great listener. And I think being a great listener, I think most people would agree is crucial, especially in jazz, but it's crucial really in any type of music that you play. Would you say that's one of the most important qualities that differentiate a good musician from a great musician?
Yeah, I would say it's the most important quality. I mean, I think obviously technique and facility is critical to, painting the painting. But, to make the painting great in a collaborative sense, you've got to be cognizant of what other people are doing. And also you've got to be compassionate to what other people are doing. And I hear a lot of great drummers, that just piss all over compositions. And, to a young drummer, I mean, that type of kind of, drumming acrobatics may be appealing, but to a songwriter or somebody or the bulk of the listening audience who doesn't maybe understand the difference between a Radamacue and a triplet, they're simply trying to be moved within the context of a musical composition. So listening, becomes critical, and it has everything to do with, why are some orchestras so much better than others? Why did Duke Ellington have such great success? I mean, Duke Ellington was able to take Sonny Greer and Cootie Williams. I mean, some of the best listeners in the world, and right to that strength. Same with Miles Davis, with Bill Evans. Those types of combinations of people who had the ultimate compassion for the composition is when the greatest musical performances are recorded.
Going back to the Pumpkins for a moment, I always liked their music, right, from the time it came out. But it wasn't until maybe a couple of years ago that I came across a video of you giving a drum clinic at the Chicago Music Exchange. For the first time, I really listened to your playing on, I think it was Geek USA, and it blew me away. And I had this epiphany where all of a sudden I realized how crucial your drumming was to each of the songs. And I know it sounds naive, but as someone who doesn't play the drums, I hadn't really noticed that up until that point. I got the sense that your drum parts were, deliberately and carefully crafted and composed to drive and elevate each song. How do you typically come up with your drum parts?
I appreciate that. And I think, if you listen to, any great band, at the heart, of that great band is a great drummer. And really, that goes all the way back to the Miles Davis Quintet with Tony Williams, or Duke Ellington with Sonny Greer, or Papa Joe Jones, or Zeppelin with Bonham, or Moon, Deep Purple with Ian Pace. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, drummers are always the X factor. You can have, great songs, but the drums really are the differentiator between what makes things great and what makes them kind of monumental. For me, again, drum parts are really just a byproduct of how I feel about things. And having, a great repertoire of tools in my toolbox, and having listened to thousands and thousands of great drummers over my lifetime, you start to increase what's available to you in any given situation. When I hear a composition for the first time, and maybe Billy brings in a song, and I just kind of let it flow through me, and then I just play whatever comes to my mind. And, oftentimes, and I would say probably 90% of the time, the first thing I play is what I end up playing. And again, I mean, I think that comes from being a good listener, but also having just tons of things in your toolbox. Like that, Tonight's a great example. I think if you watch that drum clinic, I talk about Tonight, and I start to break down the parts. The intro part during the verse where it's just the side stick and the hi-hat, I said, look, this is really taken from a Weather Report song that came out years ago that Alex Acuna played on called Birdland, right? And this other part was reminiscent of this Gino Vanelli part that I had heard years ago called The War Suite, where, something about the drumming just really struck me, and I just put it in my back pocket and said, if I ever get into a situation where I can use something like this military type of movement, I'm going to pull it out. And Tonight was the perfect vehicle for that. So I think it's, you go through your life, you take drumming performances and you put them in your back pocket and you say, okay, I'm going to find, or maybe I'll find a situation where I can use that because that really resonates with me and that can become a part of me. So that's really, it's kind of misty about how it all comes about. But for me, it's just a very organic process. It's just drawn upon past experiences.
Has that approach changed at all over time?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I think, secondarily, Billy and I have written so many songs together and played so much music that it becomes like a marriage, right? When you're, there's things, I've been married for 14 years now, very happily married, but I know my wife really well, right? I know how to have a great conversation with my wife, and I know that there's things that she generally doesn't want to discuss, right? Or there's things she doesn't want to talk about, or there's things that kind of, we're in disagreement, so we just don't talk about, certain things. And I'm not saying, that in any type of we've got a bad relationship. It's just in the give and take of any human relationship, you both start to craft a vocabulary that's acceptable to both of you that kind of makes the relationship better. And that's really, what Billy and I have is we've got this, unsaid relationship where, we've developed a vocabulary that works both for my drumming and his songwriting. So we don't really think about it that much. And when we make records, I mean, other than kind of getting into deep philosophical discussions about maybe Thelonious Monk or Cole Porter or talking about, a philosophy of songwriting, like, hey, we really want to engage in, simple melody over extremely sophisticated arrangement that still has a semblance of simplicity on top. But when you start to peel the onion apart, it becomes very complex, much like a Charles Mingus composition or a Thelonious Monk. We'll talk about that type of stuff, but we very rarely talk about, hey, can you play this or can you play that? I mean, those types of conversations we almost never have because we've just, over the years, we just know what fits. It's like a jazz orchestra. You just know that, I'm going to grab the brushes, I'm going to grab the mallets, I'm going to grab my drumsticks.
You mentioned many of the drummers that influenced you originally. You also happened to tour extensively with contemporaries, with Chad Smith, with Dave Grohl. Would you say that any of your contemporaries influenced you in any way, or you influenced each other?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think there was a point in the 90s where, we were all listening very carefully to each other. And, I'm still a huge fan of Matt Cameron and Dave, and I was just talking to Taylor Hawkins yesterday about some stuff, and Stephen Perkins and I are still friends. So I think there, you have to understand, like in the 90s, we were coming out of that kind of drum machine, Bauhaus, Love and Rockets. So when the Pumpkins and Jane's Addiction and Nirvana and Mudhoney and La Volta and Soundgarden hit for the first time, that was the first time that like that type of sophisticated drumming had been heard in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were all huge, jazz freaks. I mean, Matt Cameron was a huge Elvin Jones fan. I was a huge Tony Williams fan. Perkins was listening to all kinds of crazy shit. So there was a real sophistication in the drumming that we all, embraced and celebrated through the music. So, in my opinion, that crop of drummers, of which I'm, very honored to be a part of, really changed the face of music, I would say, as much or more than the songs themselves did. I mean, because before that you had Thompson Twins, or you had, this very kind of drum machine, or REM, you had this very basic kind of pop drumming. And we just blew the lid off that stuff with songs like, obviously, Tristessa, or, Coming Down the Mountain, or, any of those, songs off, Ultra Mega, OK, Gun, Soundgarden. I mean, Christ, those guys were playing songs at 9/8. I mean, it was the best thing that could happen to a drummer.
I was a teenager in the early 90s as I was listening to that music and played guitar and still do. And everything you're saying now makes me want to revisit a lot of that music and pay closer attention to the drumming, just like I did when I listened to that drum clinic you gave.
Yeah, those songs couldn't have been written without the drumming facility that was available to, those bands. I mean, Matt Cameron, an incredible odd time signature drummer. I mean, he could play in 5 and make you feel like you were playing in 4. I mean, that's rare talent. And, his pocket was so deep and so greasy. It made that music just so sexy and so dark. I mean, if you listen to Super Unknown, when the band really hit its stride and was really able to, take advantage of Chris's songwriting in a way that I don't think they were able to before. That drumming on like Black Hole Sun is so greasy and so good. I mean, can you imagine that with any other drummer, and it's just not the same type of music.
After the Pumpkins, you were a part of Zwan, also with Billy Corgan, and later formed the Jimmy Chamberlin Complex. How did your playing change once you were completely free to play anything you wanted to play without anyone else's input?
Yeah, I mean, I think it went back to kind of what attracted me to, what I was doing in the late 70s and early 80s. It went back to that kind of progressive spot that I always liked, but with a modern twist on it. I think I was able to go back and celebrate that type of drumming with a much broader knowledge of song construction and kind of what made things interesting. Yeah, I think it changed a lot. I mean, I think it got me out of the support role and got me really into kind of a lead role, which was a little bit different of a headspace to be in as a drummer. But, I think if you sit and you listen to me in 1989 or me in 2009, there's definitely lots and lots of common threads. I mean, I think I pretty much, for better or worse, I have, a ton of identity in my playing. Some like it, some don't. But nevertheless, I mean, my playing at any given time has always just been whatever that current representation of that identity was, but nevertheless still rooted in that kind of the way Jimmy plays or the way, I've always played.
You returned to the Pumpkins in 2006 and toured extensively with them. You left in 2009 and again rejoined the band this past summer for the tour with Marilyn Manson. What drives you to periodically revisit the Pumpkins?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think obviously, it's a celebration of, a big piece of my identity. There's a legitimacy and a sacredness to Billy and I's relationship that really can't be. You can't go for too long without re-engaging it. And I think, he would probably feel the same way. I mean, I think, we can go for spurts and go find things. But it always seems like we're going to find things to bring back to the home planet, I think, we're probably going to work again together this year. And, he said, I mean, when I came back for this last tour, he turned around and said, man, you're playing better than you've ever played before. I've never heard you play this free. And it has everything to do with me going and playing with my jazz quartet for the last 2 years. I mean, I'm playing extremely complicated, extremely sophisticated, jazz bop drumming. And then going back and playing the Pumpkins, it's not as challenging as when you're living in that Pumpkins vacuum and you're playing. That represents the top of your game. The top of my playing is kind of, at least from a facility standpoint, is beyond kind of what that band, is doing now or and remains to be seen whether we can incorporate that stuff into, what we'll do this year. But it's like anything. I mean, it's a great band and it's great music, and, we have a great relationship musically. It's bigger than any kind of emotion or any kind of thing you make, any decisions you make in the physical space, right? There's a spiritual component to it that has to be addressed. Otherwise, you're really not living your life. It has a lot of complexity to it, but can still be explained very simply. The music is great. When we get together, great things happen. When we're not together, okay things happen.
You mentioned your jazz quartet. Is Frank Catalano part of that? He's a jazz saxophonist, and you announced you've recorded 3 albums now?
That's right. Yeah, we did a John Coltrane retrospective with some great additional musicians. Percy Jones, who's I've been a huge fan of my entire life. Percy played, not only with Brian Eno, but played with Brand X for many years. And I lived and breathed that Brand X record, Unorthodox Behavior, for many summers as a young man, trying to figure out what the hell Phil Collins is doing on that record. And so to get a chance to play with Percy was a dream come true. And that really spawned, more recording with Frank. And those records have gone on to be very successful. I think 2 of those records have been in the Billboard Top 10 jazz charts for some time now. So that's been great. And, every time we play, lots of Pumpkin fans come out and they get to see a different side of me. I play a very small kit, 18-inch bass drum, 10 and 12 and 14-inch toms and just a couple cymbals. And it's a totally different part of my drumming, but one that I take very seriously.
I'm sure that you enjoy live performance with your jazz quartet as you do with the Pumpkins, despite the entirely different context for each one. What do you think you get? What do you enjoy the most from each of them?
Well, the Pumpkins is kind of, it's like going to a science fair, right? It's like unveiling your science project for the masses. And playing in the jazz band is like allowing people to watch you build your science project, right? So it's a little bit different. Pumpkins, it may take a year to play 5 minutes worth of music, just when it comes down to writing and arranging and recording. In the jazz band, it takes the same amount of time to make the music as it does to listen to it. I mean, the last record we made was all just go into the studio, one take, make it up as you go, and then you're done. There's not a lot of, second guessing and guesswork. It's a very living, breathing, organic thing. And the Pumpkins can be the same, but certainly when you're playing, back catalog and hit songs, I mean, you're going to stay, pretty much close to the template. Whereas in the jazz band, and we could change things every night. We can play Serenade to a Cuckoo as a bossa nova, and, nobody's going to know that we didn't do it that way the night before.
Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers was on the show, and he compared his experience playing with the Heartbreakers against performing with his side project, the Dirty Knobs, and it seemed like it was a similar situation where playing with the Heartbreakers was much more structured, and playing with the Dirty Knobs was an outlet, his jazz band of sorts, where each one was fulfilling in its own way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think as a musician, you've got to have somewhere to take it, right? And I think if you're playing the same notes in the same order and the same songs every night, it gets very monotonous. Although there's a challenge to that, for me as a musician and somebody who continues to practice and try to evolve on the instrument, it's great to have a vehicle like my jazz group that I can go out and explore and embrace the work that I'm doing. And I can do that when the Pumpkins are in a working cycle. I mean, I can certainly, bring that inventiveness to the practice space and I can work it into songs. But in the jazz band, it's just a lot more immediate.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the 90s for a moment. In 2010, you told Rolling Stone that you felt that music is a smaller part of people's lives now. And, quote, people don't sit around like they did in the 90s and stare at album covers thinking about Kurt and Billy. I hated the 90s. Do you still feel the same way?
I still think that's a valid point. I think music consumption habits have changed. I think music has become, it competes for a lot of the same space, the headspace that other things compete for, like Facebook and Twitter. I think the music was a standalone experience in the 90s. I mean, until video came along, it was even more of a solitary experience. So, video achieved, a different type of cultural connectivity. And I think music still has an important spot, but it's become more of the background music to another experience. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way the music or the vehicle by which the music is consumed. And, my daughter's a great example. She's a big David Bowie fan, and she's got most of my vinyl record collection now in her room. She's 13. She's got a record player. And she's got everything from Curtis Mayfield to, Hunky Dory, to Joni Mitchell, to Ricky Lee Jones. I mean, it's about everything up there, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And when she plays her records, she does have that analog experience. She'll put the needle down on, say, Earth, Wind, and Fire's greatest hits, and she'll sit down on her bed, and she'll stare at the record. And then 20 minutes is up, and she's had that exchange. And she'll get up, but when she's listening to her iPod, she's got an iPhone. So if she's listening to Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, and she's got, some of her contemporary music on, which is, I don't know what she says, Imagine Dragons or whatever she's listening to, there's this other type of exchange. It becomes the background music for this multitasking, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as she starts streaming something, she's got her earbuds in, and then all of a sudden she's cleaning her fish tank, or she's doing, some other thing, or she's even reading maybe. And it's just a different type of consumption. And I see, there's a difference there. And I don't know if it's the analog to digital, or if it's just the record does something different to people because of the way it vibrates. I mean, but there's definitely a difference. So I think the consumption habits have changed. The availability of time has become completely compressed because there's more to do in the day. I mean, think of a day in 1994 when you got up, and let's say it was Saturday, what did you have to do all day? I mean, right now, if you get up on a Saturday, you may be looking at your computer till 11 o'clock or checking email or doing other things. I mean, there's so many other things competing for that time that take up our time. Music is taking up certainly less of that time now. Or if it is, it's being consumed concurrently with other things.
Let's switch gears for a moment. You were the CEO of the tech company Live One from 2012 until last year, and recently co-founded Blue Jay Strategies, which I believe is you partner with companies in the media, entertainment, and technology sectors. What motivates you to pursue such different interests?
I mean, I think I've always been interested in cultural connectivity and whatever is driving culture. And I think that stems from me being a fan of history and trying to read between the lines as far as what was motivating people to do the things they did when they did them. So I see technology as having that type of cultural connectivity that music once enjoyed in the 90s. I mean, music was so ingrained in the culture in the 90s that if you wanted to participate in the culture and you were 25 in 1992, you pretty much had to know who the Pumpkins were. You had to have their Nirvana shirt. It was a big cultural driver. And I think, music, it still enjoys that, but it's certainly sharing that cultural driver's seat with a lot of other things, one of them being technology and one of them being the availability of information. So I see, technology, social media, the available of information is kind of taking on some of the role of music in that, it becomes a conduit for truth at some point. And granted, you can look at the internet in many ways and say it can also be a conduit for falsehood, but in the midst of that availability of information, there's an accountability that goes back and forth. And I think when you have, boots on the ground or real information by people who are really on site, it creates accountability in the media, it creates accountability between ourselves. And that's interesting to me. And I think, music used to do that. I mean, when you listen to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young talking about the shooting at Kent State, that created accountability for those situations. Governments were forced to listen. If musicians aren't going to have the balls to call out what's going on in the world, then, I'm going to start looking in other areas for that type of truth, right? So if I can get real information about what's going on through social media or information on the web, then that has cultural ramifications, I think, that are greater than people perceive right now. And that's really what interests me about technology, more so than I'm really into code or I'm into trying to build clever apps.
Right. Do you see any qualities that have served you well, both as a musician and as a businessman?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think anybody who understands how to write a song or how to play an instrument already has a broad understanding of technology and what needs to happen for technology to be efficacious and effective. So, I think the accountability that I have to my instrument has taught me a ton about business. I think the information I possess about what makes a great song makes me a great candidate to look at technology and see whether it's resonant. Because technology is a lot like, it's very musical, right? And when you think about an application like, say, Twitter, which is a great, compelling tool for people who, know how to use it in the right way. When you look at it in terms of a song, right, it's got a great rhythmic foundation. It's got a great chord structure. It's got harmony, and it's got a narrative, right? It's got the same things that a hit song would have. And when you can start to look at technology in those terms, does it have rhythm? Does it have a foundation? Is there a narrative? Does it have a chorus? Those types of things. It allows you to see inside of what people are feeling when they look at technology. Because most people, when they hear a hit song, aren't going, man, that's a great bridge, or I can't believe they've opened up with the chorus, right? But the songwriter is always thinking in those terms because they want to create the most emotional impact that they can with their offering. That's like if you listen to today, the song Pumpkin Song Today, it opens up with the chorus, right? That's a great trick to do with a song with such a compelling chorus like that. It's like the Beatles, She Loves You, right? It opens up with the chorus. I mean, that, when you've got a chorus like that, that's what you open with. And the same thing with technology. If you know those things, you can look at technology in that kind of broader musical sense and make determinations about the efficacy of that product.
That's a really interesting perspective. Jimmy, I know you have a lot going on, and I'm really grateful that you took the time to speak with me. I sincerely appreciate it. I've enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Good to chat.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed my conversation with Jimmy, it would mean a lot to me if you can take a moment to rate the podcast on iTunes, or even better, write a brief review. This will go a long way toward helping me book new guests and bring you more of these conversations. Thank you.